Hey everyone, welcome back to the 443 Security Simplified. I'm your host, Mark the Liberty, and joining me today is...
Corey Knockreiner. Sorry about that, but if you hear any snores during our podcast, if you're watching the video, this little dog next to me is the culprit. There's some ASMR for you. I hope I didn't trigger anyone. At least it wasn't lip smacking while I ate. What's worse than eating on a podcast? Snoring.
We bore Corey's dog to death by discussing several topics, including the latest way to hijack Python packages on the Python package index. Some research from a interesting company on what sounded like a scary vulnerability in Microsoft's Wi-Fi driver, and then ending with another publication from the White House to try and better security around the world.
A government document? Just a second, let me get my eye mask and pillow.
Stay awake, man. It's interesting.
It's good stuff. It's only boring to dogs.
Let's go ahead and sleepwalk our way in. So let's start with the first news story today, which is, I think the millionth time we've talked about something from researchers at Jfrog. But they seem to be doing a pretty dang good job.
What does Jfrog stand for?
I don't know. Jump frog? That's what I'm going to assume.
That could be it.
It's definitely
not. Amphibians that like J. I don't know. But they do good research.
They do a great job.
And this is not their first time talking about this subject either, I don't think.
So they do a proactive, I guess they call it community service activities of monitoring all major package indexes for things like Python packages, which is the PyPI, Python package index. They monitor NPM for JavaScript packages to look for basically funky stuff that's going on. And historically, we've talked about a few package hijacking attacks that they've discovered, typically revolving around things like typo squatting or other mechanisms. But they just published another blog post describing a new hijack method or hijack technique that they've even seen exploited in the wild, which they're calling revival hijack.
It's a revival.
Yep. Which basically allows attackers to hijack a Python package by basically taking over a package that once existed that had been deleted by the maintainers. They even gave an example that we'll talk about a little later of a hijack involving a package called pingdom v3, which is a tool associated with SolarWinds pingdom monitoring library. So basically, this all starts when a Python package that used to exist is deleted from the Python package index. And PyPI actually warns developers there's these 7 checkboxes that you have to go through and select, affirming that you understand all of the security risks and impacts of deleting that package off the index. Basically warns that all the files are gone forever, that the name will be up for grabs for anyone, and a whole bunch of other stuff. But basically, when you delete a package off of the index, it means that anyone else can go and claim that name and host their own package. And that even gets picked up by users when they go to reinstall the package or update it if the new one is at a higher version. Now, Python package index has some information about the author and the metadata that's included if you go to the index itself, but that is not reflected in the pip, the Python install package application that most developers use.
Yeah, the little command line thing you'll see when you install something. It might show a version change with a revived package, but that key difference, which is a new author, won't show up.
Yep. So Jfrog showed a proof of concept where they created a package called just revival package with a version 1.0. It's what Corey's showing on the screen right now. They then deleted that package with the original author, and then using a malicious author went and recreated the package and set the version to 4.0. So if you look on the Python package index website, you'll see the new author and the new package. But if you look through just pip, you'll see that it just says there's an update available to version 4.0. Do you want to install it or upgrade it? And this seems pretty trivial, but it actually has a wide-ranging impact. They found 120,000 deleted packages so far on the package index. They realized that a lot of these are like spam packages that PyPI will delete themselves. So they actually had a filter they applied where they looked specifically for packages with over 100,000 downloads or had been active for more than 6 months and not a spam package. And that was still 22,000 packages are open for taking. They noted there's a few reasons that a package could be removed. For example, sometimes like the functionality from something will be included in a official library or the built-in API. For example, like Node has a lot of built-in functionality. Sometimes a feature that was a secondary package will get sucked into the Node ecosystem, and you won't need that secondary package anymore. I guess that's JavaScript, but similar for Python. Sometimes maintainers just abandon their project, like they get bored of it or they go to jail, like we've talked about previously, and that could cause an incident where they have it deleted off Python package index. And sometimes package developers just choose to rewrite their package entirely, host it as a brand new one, and delete the old one off of the index. In response to this, Jfrog actually went and created an account called security_holding, and they hijacked, quote unquote, basically the 22,000 packages that are potentially vulnerable to this, or at least the most downloaded ones. And they are hosting a version 0.0.0.1 version of all these packages with really just a blank file. And there were some interesting stats they already posted as a follow-up to that, where they found in just a few days after doing that, they had over 200,000 total downloads from these packages that they were hosting. They found a few were big contributors to this. There was one package that seems to be the one that VS Code's IntelliSense recommends versus the more updated version of it. There was a package in there associated with Homebrew, which was really interesting. The way for installing like ad hoc software on Mac OS. That one stood out to me.
Which I use a lot. It's instead of figuring out lots of it's just the easy way to install stuff on Mac OS rather than trying to figure out dependencies manually.
There were some like Discord related packages that are still hard coded and a whole bunch of GitHub repositories as the package you should use to use these repos. And so all of these are cases where if this was a malicious actor that hijacked these packages, they could put whatever the heck they want in there, and anyone that goes and installs these packages would then be installing the malicious code. They gave an example of that pingdom v3, which is a package, a Python version of the pingdom application for monitoring websites. On April 12th, their automated scanner noticed that someone had been assigned as a new owner for this package, and that owner, a few days before, on March 30th, had released a new update for the package and then quickly released another new update that included a suspicious looking base64 encoded payload. Payload basically checked to see if it was if an environment variable was set. Specifically, it was like a Jenkins URL. So presumably, is it on a build server? And if so, it goes and retrieves a package or a payload from a web URL and attempts to run it. And unfortunately, by the time they discovered this, that URL had been taken down, so they don't have any idea what that secondary payload was. But
I don't know if they said for sure it was taken down. They said they could never retrieve the payload, so it was either taken down or it could have been a smart targeted page that was only paying attention to certain IPs or geos.
Yeah. But you could imagine the damages of installing arbitrary software on a build server, a Jenkins server, what that could potentially cause to a supply chain.
Yeah.
So this one, this isn't like a complex hack to take over things. It's not even relying on social engineering. It literally just, like, all it takes is a package getting deleted and an attacker can slurp it up and start going after anyone that uses that package and isn't paying attention.
And it appears this one was the case of like the second example of why a package gets taken down, just a maintainer decides to stop maintaining it.
Yep. They noted like it doesn't rely on the victims making a mistake with typo squatting. It can prey on developers that believe that like a once safe package, like version 1.0.1, that is safe. And reinstalling it should continue to be safe. If you believe that, you could fall victim to this. And also many development pipelines just automatically install packages straight from the Python package index. So there's a lot of risk around this as a potential attack. And so far, not a lot of built-in protections from the Python package index itself. They've got some. They've got a undisclosed blacklist of packages that cannot be reclaimed, probably like the really highly downloaded ones that have been deleted. But that isn't like ubiquitous to everything. Like there's no current block preventing someone from re-registering a name that's been given up. And in fact, deleting the package frees it up within like hours, it seems like.
Other than Jfrog, I don't know if we can rely on it forever, but right now Jfrog in the appendix lists a bunch of things they're reserving. So it appears Jfrog is watching for packages being deleted and reserving names themselves as a stopgap mitigation. I don't know how long they'll do that.
I mean, it is effectively free, so there isn't really any cost to them doing that. So hopefully they continue it until some built-in
Yeah.
mechanism becomes available. I mean, it's not all like doom and gloom. So in example they gave, the pingdom v3, as soon as they discovered it, they reported it to the Python package index organization, and they immediately took down the malicious content. So like there is a security team to respond to these, but this feels like something where there needs to be some more built-in controls to prevent something as easy as just taking over immediately a package that was deleted. Like maybe a grace period where you can't reclaim the name, or just never be able to reclaim a package name.
Yeah, I might even go with never. I mean, I guess there could be like never by default, with the only possibility of reclaiming the name is if someone actually goes to PyPy and shows how the original maintainer has turned over the project to this new person on purpose.
Yeah,
Because
but
it's
even that,
trivial to
like,
add an underscore change a name. And it's the same name that is the issue here. I mean, the big deal is with all the typo squatting issues, a user has to make a mistake. And I think if you're command line in pip or whatever, you can maybe tab complete something and get one of those typo squatting. But nowadays, how many people actually go manually and install? I mean, they're part of install scripts, and the install script is going to like pick the exact name of the package every time. So this is a big deal in the sense that if you have other scripts that are going and grabbing things in an automated fashion from PyPy, and one of those packages is removed and reclaimed, it's just going to happen to you. So I think it's worse than typo squatting. I think they should just not let those names be used again if the maintainer goes away and removes the package. With the small caveat is a new maintainer that like officially takes over might have to contact PyPy or something.
yep. I guess one mitigation that like software engineering outfits can, and at least the larger ones do have, is you mirror your own package index where you only host known saved versions of them. And presumably your own package index would never go and re-download the same version. You know that the version on there is safe. You've done
Or
your own
if it
analysis
did, it
on it.
would be quarantine. Like if you're doing known good, even if it grows and gets something, it doesn't get put into your index officially until it's somehow vetted.
Yep, exactly. So that is one mitigation, but that's more work and difficult for
Yeah.
smaller organizations to manage something like that at scale.
I think only the hugest organizations actually do that, like the Amazons of the world that use a lot of open source or something, but realize how big a target. I feel like there's very few teams that are reading code of their open source packages or
Well,
even
at
just
least
doing
that's
basic diffs.
hopefully at some point maybe the AI cyber challenge will help out with that and open
Yeah.
source software
We'll have
security.
AI to do it for us.
Exactly. Either way, cool research from JFrog, and I'm looking forward to their next blog post in like 2 weeks that we're going to talk about again.
Yeah, as far as supply chain issues, I'm glad they're looking out at all the repositories.
Yep. So moving on, if you remember back in June on Microsoft Patch Tuesday, they disclosed and patched CVE 2024 30078, which they
Of
described
course,
as
I
a high.
remember those random string
Yeah,
of numbers. I do
you
remember the
may.
CV 2024 part. There's only like 1,000 of those, so
You probably remember talking about, or I guess for
yeah,
our
yeah.
listeners, hearing us talk about the high severity remote code execution vulnerability in the Windows Wi Fi driver that set
But
off
with the
alarms.
caveat, though, right? And maybe that's what we'll learn today. This was a big unauthenticated Wi-Fi that they gave a decent severity, but Microsoft did say it was hard to exploit or something like that.
Like less
And I
likely.
think we talked about it because they didn't share enough technical detail. And while I always would like to believe that they're correct, it's hard to exploit when you have something like an unauthenticated Wi-Fi throw a packet or two and things blow up type of flaw. You really want to know if they're correct there.
Yep. Well, thanks to the researchers at CrowdFence,
Crowd fence.
we now have that technical detail and technical analysis of the vulnerability to confirm whether it is a really big deal or a not so big deal.
Yeah, and it's very much technical detail. I do not envy you what you're about to do and describe this like machine language reversing in a way that our audience will understand. But go for it. Tell us about
Yep.
this detail, Mark.
So they just published their analysis of the vulnerability after they both statically and dynamically evaluated the patch to find the flaw and look for potential exploitability.
I'm
So
sure
remember,
everyone knows the difference between static and dynamic, but static is basically using tools just to look at the file, not actually like in the case if it's a DLL, you're not actually watching it running, you're just looking at the file. Differences between maybe patched and unpatched, using something to pull out the machine language, whereas dynamic is it's a running process and you're using different tools to actually pay attention to how it runs, memory location. I mean, you can reverse it both ways, live and static. But yeah,
yep.
and most of our audience probably knows that. But in case you didn't, static and
And if you
dynamic.
remember, the worst case scenario for this vulnerability would have been anyone within Wi-Fi range or with a strong enough antenna could potentially exploit this vulnerability on any Windows machine that has Wi-Fi turned on. That would be the worst case
Windows
scenario.
11. Yep.
So they started by diffing the patch, basically taking the pre-patch version and the patched version of the vulnerable driver and just seeing what changed. The driver itself was the n-wi-fi.sys driver. It's called a filter driver, so it sits between the protocol driver and the mini port driver. And if you don't know Windows architecture, mini port drivers, they're responsible for managing the network interfaces on Microsoft Windows. And basically, this driver, n-wi-fi.sys, is responsible for reading and monitoring packets received from the Wi-Fi mini port driver before passing them to the next driver in the stack. So they focused on one function that changed that's basically responsible for translating the 802.11 wireless packets into Ethernet frames so that other protocols or systems on the endpoint can interact with them easier.
Has a really long name. .11 translate 802.11 to Ethernet NDIS packet. So a long name, but a very intuitive name because it does exactly what you just said it does.
Yep.
The name.
Quick lesson for the folks that didn't get their Network Plus or that got their Network Plus 20 years ago. Ethernet frames and Wi-Fi frames, they're kind of like an onion where you peel off layers to get to lower, I guess technically higher layers in the protocol. You start with the Ethernet frame, which contains an IP packet, which contains a transport segment. So Ethernet around IP, around like TCP or UDP. Wi-Fi is just a little bit different in that they don't use Ethernet frames. They use 802.11 frames to encapsulate that IP packet with the TCP or UDP or whatever segment inside of it. So in 802.11, there's a header called the logical link controller or LLC header. This used to exist in Ethernet frames, but with the newer Ethernet frame standard, it does not anymore. It's an 8-byte header that gives some information about the 802.11 frame. If there's VLANs being used in that wireless packet, then that LLC header type is going to be set to 81,000 or 8100 rather. And there will also be a 4-byte VLAN header behind that, the 802.1q header. So that would bring the total size of this header, the LLC header, to 12 bytes instead of 8.
So all of these packets, you immediately expect 8 bytes. If there's VLAN, you should expect only 4 more bytes.
Correct. So the vulnerable driver, in the vulnerable driver version, the vulnerable function does not verify that the VLAN header bytes are actually present in the packet when that LLC header is set to 8100. So basically, the underlying driver expects there to be 12 bytes, but if there aren't, it will, if there's only 8 bytes for whatever reason, it'll still attempt to read 12 bytes out of that packet. And this creates a out of bound read issue, which translates into an overwrite in the part of the code that's responsible for building the Ethernet header as part of this translation process. Basically, if the LLC header type is set to 8100 and the VLAN ID is higher than the hexadecimal 0x600, which is like 1536 out of, 25,000 or so potential VLAN IDs, then a portion of the Ethernet frame will get written outside of the allocated memory space into just adjacent memory. It's usually the last 2 bytes of the source MAC address from the Ethernet frame, which is under the attacker's control. So in theory, they can overwrite and write an arbitrary 2 bytes somewhere in memory. Now there's a
2
lot
bytes is not a lot. Like, I know there's lots of little tricks with shellcode staging where if you have like 12 to 21 bytes, you can do some funky things, but 2 bytes is nothing. And the other thing we got to remind everyone is where in memory is very important. Besides how much memory you have to overwrite, where you're actually sitting in Windows memory, buffer, heap, all kinds of other boring, benign structures makes a big difference, which I'm sure you'll get into.
Yep. Generally, you want the memory buffer to have like useful things like pointers to other functions, so you can build it's called a gadget chain to let you execute arbitrary code. But in this case,
the more you have to build that chain, the more you hopefully have buffer to have the code to do all the hops necessary to get wherever you need to be.
there are ways around like limitations of small overwrites like this. You can use like spraying techniques to seed values throughout the entire buffer and then chain together what you need. But it becomes more and more complex the smaller the amount of data you can write is. And there's other limitations in this specific vulnerability too. So the function verifies that the 802.1q, so the VLAN header's type ID field is correct. So for example, that type ID field should be 0800 for IPv4 encapsulated packets. Might be different for IPv6 or other packets. It also verifies that the VLAN ID inside that header matches the VLAN ID inside the LLC header. So there's these additional checks that happen where it makes it extremely difficult to overwrite the bytes in a way that doesn't screw up that calculation later on and just halt before it gets to the part of the function that would actually overwrite and potentially give them code execution. So basically, in practice, it means they need to get lucky and have the proper bytes behind the packet buffer that would allow them to pass that PID and the VLAN ID checks, which is borders from extremely difficult to entirely impossible in a practical attack. I can't hear your dog snoring. It's amazing.
Did you hear? Yeah, sorry, my follow-up's not good enough.
So cute.
Calla Lily is right under me.
And taking a nap.
She's cute.
Anyways, what were we saying? Buffer overflows.
Yeah. We're getting to, it's extremely hard, but they actually did some dynamic analysis where they did some attempts.
And so the other piece for this that makes it difficult is they confirm Microsoft's announcement that the attacker has to be on the same Wi-Fi network as the target. So you can't just like arbitrarily throw Wi-Fi frames at that wireless driver. You have to be on the same network, which means either an evil twin attack, or if you're on a public network, you have to crack the access points like key that it uses in order to send arbitrary packets to other hosts. That adds complexity too. And so like finally they come down to it, like they were able to partially exploit it. And by exploit, I mean like overwrite memory, but they, even in their debugger, had to like set up the best case scenario and like manually overwrite buffers just to see what would happen if they were able to do that. And they basically found that it's almost impossible to exploit this in practice in a way that would give code execution. They could potentially overwrite another packet that arrives right after yours, the malicious one, specifically only 4 bytes of it. And it would have to be placed straight after the malicious packet in memory, which is unlikely and basically useless.
Crazy.
And so the practical impact of this is low, thankfully. I for one am glad that this didn't turn out to be a insane critical.
They said it was very unlikely and useless as far as no interesting data to be leveraged.
Yep. So either way, like this could have been a potential scary vulnerability, and on the face of it, like it sounded like it was a potentially scary vulnerability even without the
Especially
details.
with the rating, it does show you that with the right, like in CVE or CVSS, I should say, ratings, Common Vulnerability Scoring System, they do have a weighted thing for difficulty exploit, but it is kind of interesting that the rating, at least from Microsoft, of this vulnerability was pretty high, despite the fact that I would almost feel like in my gut the exploitable rating should cut this in half. Like it's very unlikely to even be exploited, let alone do anything if it is. So there she goes again.
And
Uh,
last bit before we move on from the story too,
yeah.
CrowdFence is not a good company.
Why is that? Phil,
So
wow, that's a hot take, Mark. I was not
yeah,
expecting this part.
I did some digging, and they're actually a broker for like black market or underground 0-day vulnerabilities.
Oh, great. So
They've
this
got
is why they
a
were trying to test it.
they've got a bug bounty program where they offer like up to $9 million for like mobile 0-click or 1-click
That's
execution
crazy that
chains.
mobiles are up to 9 million instead of just one or two.
Yep,
But yes, that's
exactly.
horrible. I do not like exploit brokers that sit on vulnerabilities instead of help get them patched. I
Exactly.
especially don't like them when they sell them at that price. That said, I guess bug bounties in general are good, but when you're
I mean,
sitting
bug
on super
bounties
horrible thing for a 9 million, it feels more like extortion.
in the traditional sense of like a company like WatchGuard paying researchers bounties for vulnerabilities they find, like that's great. Like I love that program. We get a lot of value out of it as a software engineering company ourselves. But a broker like this that presumably is buying vulnerabilities at such a premium to sell them to other organizations to use in like commercial exploitation tools or nation state governments, I'm way less excited about that type of bug bounty program. So yeah, hot take. I don't like CrowdFence, even if I do like this research that they published. Anyways, moving on to the last story, and I guess a continuation of a saga that we've been talking about for years now. How it was like 4 years ago, 5 years ago, Corey, where we predicted that hackers would take down the internet by disrupting BGP, which is the backbone
Yeah,
routing
we picked
infrastructure.
two, BGP or DNS, but it was BGP was one of our big ones. I think we've done a number of stories after that, which we'll probably get into a little on ways to secure BGP, which are starting to filter in. But when we did those stories, our other complaint is, well, BGP is a huge vulnerability, as we'll get into for the internet. There are ways to secure it, but it feels like it's the same as anti-spoofing. Like unless every ISP does it, if one registrar or one ISP is not doing it, you still have a weak link. So yes, definitely remember that BGP is dangerous. I wonder if anyone agrees with us, Mark.
So, the White House Office of the National Cyber Director just published a roadmap for addressing security weaknesses in the BGP protocol. So they start this whole like 20-page document with an intro that I want to read verbatim here. They say, quote, a secure and open internet is critical to the economic prosperity and national security of the United States. However, many aspects of the internet's architecture and ecosystem, including the principal technology used to route traffic across the thousands of independent networks that comprise the internet, do not provide adequate security for the threats we face today. So they go through and note a lot of the security weaknesses we've been talking about, but everyone in the industry has been talking about for what feels like
Yeah,
decades
it's
now.
it's decent for non-technical people because while it's high level, they walk you through what BGP is and later what some of the protection mechanisms, the simple things
Yep.
like ASNs, ASs, etc. So
Yep.
it's a good
I
primer
guess
too.
10,000 foot level BGP is comprised of autonomous system numbers or autonomous systems, which you can think of like a routing organization or a group or something. It could be an ISP, it could be an individual company, it could be one piece of an individual company. Those autonomous systems are responsible for advertising the IP address space. The prefixes is the name for that they own. So for example, like WatchGuard might advertise our private IP address space into the BGP ecosystem saying, in order to reach this IP address, route it through these autonomous system numbers. And all the magic happens on the back end where BGP ASs around the entire world coalesce and build these routing tables to get people to the destination they're trying to go to in the shortest, preferably, number of hops possible. So BGP has been around for forever, or decades now, and it was not originally built with security in mind. And so there's a few like weaknesses in just the baseline BGP. For example, it doesn't have an ability to validate the authority of remote networks to originate announcements for specific destinations. So there's no built-in way of proving that like my AS, my autonomous system, actually has the authority to say, if you want to get to 1.1.1.1, come to me. There's no way to verify the integrity or authenticity of messages that are exchanged between networks. These advertisements get like bounced around and forwarded on to other autonomous systems to build that full path for routing to any given IP address. There's no capability to ensure the authenticity or integrity of information from remote networks that are being passed around. And direct routing announcements that violate policies between neighboring networks, there's no mechanisms to protect against that. And we actually saw an example of that in 2018, which really this story felt like yesterday, but crap, it was 6 years ago, where where Google briefly had an outage because a tiny ISP in Nigeria advertised in their routing
Wrong
space
things.
the authority for Google's IP addresses. That was picked up by a telco in China and then picked up by a telco in Russia. Basically caused all of Google to get routed through China and Russia in a way that was not designed to do.
Pretty dangerous.
Exactly.
But we're talking
all from a
about
mistake.
the normal BGP. There are
Yep.
new mechanisms that kind of solve a lot of those.
Exactly. So this document then goes on to describe there are actually like standards that are available right now and in use in some capacity around the world to fix a lot of these security concerns. So they talk about RPKI, which is Resource Public Key Infrastructure. It's basically like a mirror of how we do website security right now, where you've got a certificate authority. We've got dozens, or I guess probably 100 certificate authorities that we collectively, or at least our web browsers, have agreed are trusted. Those certificate authorities
Simplify,
verify.
it's public-private keys, but
Yep.
the certificate authority is some trusted party that certifies that the public-private keys being issued to both parties are correct. So
Yep.
it's all based on public-private keys for the BGP servers to essentially
And
trust each other, but
yep.
someone has to be the trust group to make sure those certificates are or public-private keys are
So for
trustworthy.
like websites, it's a certificate authority verifying and validating that someone owns the domain name. In
Yeah.
RPKI, it's a certificate authority verifying that a autonomous system owns the IP address prefix space. And those certificate authorities are managed by the local regional internet number routing organizations. So like in the North America, we've got ARIN, the American
Yeah.
Association of Internet Numbers or something like that.
REARS, if we want more acronyms for our discussion.
We absolutely do want more acronyms. This is a cybersecurity podcast.
We have at least
Regional
one more to
Internet
go.
Registers. Yep. So there's this mechanism already to build a public key infrastructure, the RPKI infrastructure for BGP specifically. And then with that established, then there's two additional concepts. There's the route origin validation, which is a process for verifying BGP advertisements by using route origin authorization messages, or ROAs. So ROAs, they're like a piece of data that declares which networks are authorized to originate, quote unquote, advertise specific address prefixes from those blocks in BGP. And they are digitally signed with a certificate that is backed by that RPKI infrastructure. ROV is the process that a BGP router can verify an advertisement and filter out invalid ones by looking at that ROA data. Now, these mechanisms, they're not new. And in fact, in Europe, 70% of BGP routes have published ROAs. And the adoption rate, though, in the United States is quite a bit lower, only
It's like
39%.
39. By the
Yep.
way, this is I'm a United States person that likes our country and believes that we founded it minus a few mistakes for good freedom intentions. But with all our exceptionalism and we're the best, 39% compared to 70. This is, I'm glad the White House is talking about this and maybe they'll be able to push this. But this is what we talked about in the past when we first kind of introduced this whole way of securing BGP, that not many people are using it. And it's kind of disappointing that more than half of the United States doesn't use it. They do get into, I don't know how much you talk about it, but they do get into some of the reasons people don't move to it. Old routers need, costs associated with it. But I still think it's kind of crazy that you know, I guess we're a little less than half of Europe or a little more than half of Europe, but that still kind of stinks in my opinion.
They even
We're supposed to be the
specifically
ones that
called
made
out,
the internet.
yeah, well, we are. They even specifically called out the US federal government themselves as a big part of the issue. The US federal government owns 21% of the entire IPv4
That's a
space
lot.
in the United States, or in, I guess, the Aaron region. And they've got a significantly lower RPKI adoption rate relative to the private sector. They didn't call out by name, but
I'm
they
glad
said
you
there's
said
several.
Aaron. You're talking about ARIN. For a second, I
Yes.
was like, Aryan region mark? What the heck? Did this suddenly become a horrible podcast?
No,
Aaron, not Aryan.
Aaron. Yep. And then they also called out, I guess not by name, but there's a few large commercial network providers that have really complex internet address inventories and low ROA adoption levels. And like you said, they talked about some of the reasons for that, like administrative reasons, meaning the IP address allocation occurred 20, 30 years ago, and the person that was responsible for that's gone, and there's just no one knows how the heck to deal with it. There's fear of like disrupting customers. Like, what happens if I turn on this mechanism and like all of my customers can't get to my website or my services anymore? But they then go on to give like basically a baseline for network providers, for service providers, like step-by-step instructions on here's how you should like actually start adopting this in a way that manages risk for your organizations. The end of the report is all about like step-by-step instructions for like how to do risk-based planning to figure out what is the IP space you even own, like who are the autonomous systems you communicate with, how are you using BGP routing just in general. They talk about like how do you go about publishing your ROAs. So the signed attestations for the IP addresses that you own. How should you go about getting explicit contractual requirements with your service providers that they will validate BGP enabled routes? And how do you monitor the status of your ROA data? So like some high level, but still like at least good guidance on how to start rolling this out as an organization. They've got
A
another
lot of
section
a
for,
lot of detail on the planning phase, at least.
yes, they've got guidance for service providers on how to do ROV deployments, how to help your customers with their ROAs, and also how to disclose your routing security practices to be transparent about this. And then guidance for the federal government and everything. So at the end of the day, it's like it was all pretty high level. I think it does a really good job of explaining pretty technical concepts so that
For
anyone
sure.
can understand them. It outlines some steps the US government has already taken and some steps that it wants to take, and also some call outs for the private industry on steps that they should take too. Because at the end of the day, like deploying these standards will help. But like you said, Corey, like it really only matters if everyone starts using it.
Yeah, otherwise the weakest links become worse and worse. I think it's a good step. I hope it's followed by my same feeling happened when they first released the White House cybersecurity strategy with the 5 pillars, and I'm like, oh, great stuff, but I need to see some action that will give it some teeth. And we've seen that. We've actually, I guess, we haven't literally seen regulation yet, but we've seen follow up publication from CISA, warnings, communities coming together to uh, uh, fine tune things like secure design. And I feel like it's all in a strategy to first inform, encourage, but eventually regulate. Like I hope that's the case they're going with the White House cybersecurity strategy and that this is the first step. And maybe we'll see some publications from CISA afterwards with more details with the community of what's expected for how you should be running any public BGP servers if you do, blah, blah, blah. And eventually, if we still don't get to that 95% or whatever, at least most servers doing it, they'll might make it requirements, at least for, if not for all companies, at least for companies that work with governments. I guess they have to get their own. I guess
Yeah,
they can't do that until the federal government is complying to this, and they're one of the worst offenders right now. But
exactly. I
still,
would call this
it's
like a
good stuff.
success if like a year from now, or maybe generous 2 years from now, like 100% of the IPv4 space owned by the federal government is covered by ROA records. Like that'd be good. Get
Yeah.
their house in order, and then you can like lead by example with the private sector too.
Exactly. Yeah, no, but good stuff. It's definitely stuff the whole, and we obviously weren't even the first. This BGP problem has been kind of the best kept secret problem for a long time on the internet. So it's good to see people still pushing the new security mechanisms that will help.
Yeah, and I just am in general happy with how much like the US federal government is trying to focus on cybersecurity lately. Like with that cybersecurity strategy you mentioned, with all of the push from CISA on currently voluntary initiatives, but really powerful initiatives. And now this as well too. It does seem like they are like genuinely taking some of the bigger risks seriously and trying to
Yeah.
put some of the weight of the federal government behind like giving guidance and recommendations, and at some point probably requirements to improve security across our country and around the world. So that's good.
Yep.
America.
Merca.
Exactly. Maybe at some point we'll catch up to the rest of Europe with
Yeah.
security practice
One day we might have an internet infrastructure like South Korea.
or privacy protections like the entirety of the EU
Yeah. What
someday.
happened to our GDPR will come to the US as a federal law. That's one that I'm disappointed. It's been quite a while since we made that prediction, and it's definitely much needed.
Yes, 100%. But I'm not getting my hopes up until at least after November.
We'll see.
We will see. Hey everyone, thanks again for listening. As always, if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. If you have any questions on today's topics or suggestions for future episode topics, you can reach out to us on Instagram. We're at watchguard_technologies. Thanks again for listening, and you will hear from us next week.
Easy
Cool.
peasy.